All right, welcome class. Today, we're going to talk about price inflexibility. Why there's price inflexibility. We started, we ended last time talking about that, and so we'll continue talking about that this time. And yes, I have a guest with me, my little daughter Tirza. She wasn't being quiet upstairs, so I needed to include her in our lesson today. So, anyways, the joys of working from home. So, let's talk about this graph. When talking about this graph, I want to tell you why there is price inflexibility. Why it's almost always the price is going to be at P0. Why is that? Well, first let's talk about the top part of the demand curve. Remember, the top part of the demand curve is elastic. So do you want to lower prices or raise prices in the upper part? Well, a reminder, in general, you would lower prices, right? We're going to be in the D category. Low prices is the dominant strategy for oligopolies. And of course, you want to lower prices because also total revenue rises when you lower prices in the elastic part of the demand curve. And so you want to lower prices. Now, once you get to the inelastic part, you don't necessarily want to lower prices, right? Because when you lower prices in the inelastic part, then um, total revenue would go down. But of course, total revenue isn't everything, right? You also want to consider profit. And so here's some other reasons why price stays at P0. So I told you before, MC1 is a an imaginary marginal cost line, and MC2 is also another imaginary marginal cost line. And so let's play some what ifs. Let's play what if we had different marginal cost curves. So let's say we had this as our marginal cost curve. Just like a monopoly, you put, so Kipton is going to steal Tirza to go upstairs and watch My Little Pony. Is that the plan? All right, so Tirza, you go with Bubba. All right. So anyways, as I said, we put marginal, if we have a different marginal cost line, we put, just like with Monopoly, where marginal cost intersects marginal revenue, we go up from there to the demand line. And the demand, at that point, that would determine our price. In the long run, though, you would like to try, if you're in this market, in the oligopoly market, you would like to try and lower your price because your total revenue would rise. But ideally, though, still, you would have, that would be your price. And the only way you could lower your price is if you could potentially lower your marginal costs. So let's say you lower your marginal costs. You lower your marginal costs to MC1. If you're at MC1, well, imagine your gray marginal revenue line. It continues down this white dashed line, then goes down to MR1. So anyways, you're intersecting your marginal revenue line right here at this point. So you go up against your demand line, and P0 is the price you would set it at, which makes sense. But let's say you have another marginal cost line, and it's this time it's right here. Well, it's intersecting this dashed white line, which is going to be your continued marginal revenue line. And so your marginal revenue is intersecting your marginal cost right here. So you're going to go up again to the demand line, and again, your price is P0. And so there are some situations, like with the first marginal cost line I mentioned, where you could have a price that's not P0, but oftentimes if you're anywhere between MC1 and MC2, you're intersecting the marginal revenue line at the same spot, Therefore, your demand and your price is going to be the same. Um, and so let's just do one that's beyond MC2 just to see what would happen there. So if I put my marginal cost line here, again, I go to where marginal cost intersects marginal revenue, and I go up to the demand line, and this would be my price. So yes, there are some prices that are not P0, but when you're in the elastic part, if you're at maybe the the first marginal cost line that we talked about, marginal cost 1A, if we're at that point, yes, you may not be at P0, but in the long run, you're going to want to lower your costs so you can get to a point E where you're going to have more total revenue and more profit. Now, if you're down here below MC2, again, lowering prices is the dominant strategy, but there is some incentive to try and get the prices high, especially if you're in the inelastic part. So you might try and collude with people, with your oligopoly partners, of course, and you might try and jack the prices up. But of course, if you were to try and jack the prices up, there's a lot of incentive for cutting it. And so even though it's possible that someone might try and collude and have an inelastic demand curve, and the likelihood of that happening long term is unlikely because all the competitor needs to do is lower prices and they're going to beat their other competitor. So anyway, so there's a lot of incentive to lower prices instead of raise them. And so what keeps people from lowering prices even lower than MC2? Well, again, if you're in the inelastic demand curve and you lower them below that, then you're more likely to lose total revenue. So yes, there is some incentive to go lower because you gain more market share from the other competitor. So if they have a high price and you have a low price, people will buy your product instead of their product. So there's incentive to lowering the price, but again, not for profit's sake, for market share sake. And so in the long run, you wouldn't lower your prices. All right. So now let's move on and let's talk about when companies will sometimes do price wars. So right now there is a price war with Saudi Arabia and Russia. And some would say that Saudi Arabia and OPEC are in an oligopoly market. And so Saudi Arabia, being one of the largest suppliers of oil in the world, has in some ways price leadership. And so you may have not exactly a true oligopoly where there's only like 4 competitors. Because if you look here, these are just the countries that are part of OPEC, and OPEC doesn't always agree with each other. There are plenty of other countries not in OPEC, like the United States and Trinidad, for example, that are competitors. I mean, almost every country in the world has some amount of oil supply, their own oil rigs. And so there's lots of competition, but Saudi Arabia might act like an oligopoly by doing this thing called price leadership. And so price leadership, what's common among price leadership markets that act like oligopolies is they change the price hoping that others will follow their price change. And so the way they do this is they have infrequent price changes because they're afraid that if they change it, not everyone will follow suit and then they'll stop being the leader, so to speak. And then they also communicate very loudly. They communicate very loudly when they do make price changes. And so they'll have at a news conference, and say, hey, we're going to lower supply, we're going to raise supply, we're going to raise prices, lower prices, um, and so that's another part of price leadership. But then sometimes another part of price leadership is to keep themselves in power is they might do limit pricing or predatory pricing, sometimes called competitive pricing, which is what they're doing with Russia right now. Saudi Arabia and Russia got in a political diplomatic fight, I guess you could say, and so now they're both lowering the prices to try and steal the other competitors' um, not profit, market share. And so, of course, in the long run, we know, is this a good idea for profit and revenue? No, because as you lower price on an inelastic thing, you're going to lose total revenue. So both companies cannot keep this price war up for very long before they'll go back to um, inflexible, moderate prices, most likely. Now, it's hard to always tell whether a company is in an oligopoly. And so there's been some ways to tell what sort of market a company is in, whether it's an oligopoly or not. And so one is the 4-firm sales concentration ratio. They take the 4 top firms and they see what percent of the market share they own to determine if an oligopoly exists. There's a problem with this 4-firm sales concentration ratio, and that is, yep, there's a cement truck there, yep. The problem is cement trucks are, if you were to do a research all across America, you'd find out cement companies, there's thousands of them. They're very local. Yeah, they're local. And so because there's a lot of them, you would think, oh, well, there's no monopoly here. But locally, there are usually monopolies because a cement truck, it can only travel so far before the cement in its barrel freezes up. And so there might be thousands of cement companies out there, but only one in your area. And so you might say, oh, well, I'll go to the next state over and get some cement from there. But the problem is they can't travel that far with their cement trucks before the cement dries up. And so it's unlikely that they're truly a competitor. And so even though the 4-firm sales concentration ratio for the entire United States would seem to suggest there is no oligopoly, for local people, there is an oligopoly, almost maybe even a monopoly. And so it's not a perfect measure of whether you are in an oligopoly market or not. So another thing that they came up with was they call it the Herfindahl Index. The Herfindahl Index measures the sales concentration ratio of all the firms, and it squares their market share, and it ends up coming to be a number between 10,000 or some number between 10,000 and 0. And the more closer to 10,000, the more of a market or oligopoly it is. I mean, think about it. If you take a monopoly, and a monopoly owns 100% of the market, you take 100 and you square it, so 100 times 100, you get 10,000, right? And so, so this would be a monopoly. And if you're closer to 0, you're more of a competitive market. So let's do an example together. So here's an example of a market where you have one company is 25% of the market share, another company is 15%, another 15%, another 15%, another company is 10%, another company is 5%, so you have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 companies. So you might say to yourself, well, this doesn't seem to be an oligopoly, or maybe you think it is an oligopoly. You don't really know for sure. And so let's do the Herfindahl Index and find out. So I want you to square the market shares and see what number you come up with. Pause the video, do it, go. All right, so hopefully you've done it. Here's your answer. The answer is 1,500. So does that sound like a number that's closer to monopoly or closer to pure competition? Well, if you click on this link at the top of the screen, you'll go to Investopedia. And here at Investopedia, there is a video explaining it. Again, it goes into lots of detail. But basically right here is what we want to look at. It says, a market with a Herfindahl index of less than 1,500 is considered to be a competitive marketplace. A Herfindahl index of 1,500 to 2,500 considered to be moderately concentrated marketplace. And so we're right at 1,500. So we would be considered close to competitive or moderately concentrated. Of course, it says a number between 2,500 and greater is a highly concentrated. So now you're in the oligopoly, monopoly market region if you're above 2,500. All right, so we have our example. Now let's talk about why the Herfindahl index is not a perfect measure as well. Here's some reasons why. One is even if you have an oligopoly in your country, there's overseas competitors that also are competing against you. So to truly do a Herfindahl index, you'd want to do a Herfindahl index of the market share of the entire world, which is sometimes more difficult to measure. Yes, there's a truck. Yep, and so another reason why the Herfindahl index isn't perfect is because you might have an oligopoly in one industry, maybe in the plane industry, like Piers was pointing out, but some people might use the truck instead of the plane to transport their stuff. Yeah, they might use a truck instead of a plane. And so that's called inter-industry competition. Another thing that is why the Herfindahl index doesn't work is because you might have an oligopoly or monopoly in the copper industry, but if your prices are too high, people go and buy aluminum instead. There's enough substitutes for your product that you don't have oligopoly power for that reason. And so that would be an example of why the Herfindahl index is not a perfect measure of an economy always. But you might find yourself having to calculate the Herfindahl index for the AP test. You're all done? Yeah. Okay, you're all done. All right. Now, let's talk about advertising. And hopefully you watch those other funny videos I showed at the beginning on Canvas, where it shows an example of some advertisements that maybe correct a market failure. Where they, the purple mattress provides you information that helps you, realize, hey, maybe if I buy a purple mattress, I'm actually getting a better deal than if I just go buy some other Sealy or whatever mattress out there. And so advertising, when you have oligopolies and monopolies, just like you have the ability to spend more money for research and development, when you have an oligopoly or monopoly, you also have more money that you could put towards advertising as well. Of course, you may be less likely to do that in a monopoly again, because why do you need to advertise? But in an oligopoly, advertising still might be important. And so again, advertising hopefully corrects any market failures that might be out there. But at the same time, like the Old Spice commercial, that doesn't do anything. I mean, that might make society worse off if they think that buying Old Spice is better for you and you somehow will, attract the opposite gender or attract whoever because of that one product. So in a sense, advertising is a double-edged sword. It might fix market failures. It might make more market failures. And so advertising, just like research and development, could potentially defeat monopolies because because you can provide the information to show that you're better than your competitor. But so advertising is important, but especially in oligopolies. But there are some flaws to it. Now, just as I said in the last slide, advertising can potentially eliminate a monopoly or eliminate an oligopoly potentially. Monopolies can also potentially advertising can ensure monopolies because of their advertising, because it's so expensive to advertise and try and keep up with the other person. So two ones that come to my mind are Geico and Progressive. I mean, they're constantly doing advertising. If one of them stopped doing advertising, the other one would suffer. And it's almost necessary in that industry to advertise to try and stay in business. And so monopolies can ensure their power sometimes by advertising. So advertising, like I said, is a double-edged sword. It has its positives, it has its negatives, but it's definitely a big part of oligopolies. And so that's why we're bringing it up. Now, let's talk about the benefits of collusion. So this is your standard demand curve for an oligopoly, but what happens if you collude? You partner up with your partner and you both decide to raise the prices. Well, then you have an inelastic demand curve and you act like a monopoly and you get a lot of profit. And so a oligopoly can look like a monopoly, or it could look like a kink demand curve. Just depends on whether you're working in collusion or not. Of course, the positive here is that most likely, if there was collusion, it's not likely to last because there's a lot of incentive to break the collusion. So that's a good thing. All right, now time for a quiz. Which of these graphs is in a graph of monopolistic competition? Correct answer, this one down here. You could tell by the way it intersects the demand curve, not at the lowest average total cost point, but close, and there is no economic profit. All right, next question. Which of these is an oligopoly? Correct answer, this one. This is your oligopoly. You could have said this one, an oligopoly and collusion, but best answer would have been this one. All right, one more. Which of these is perfect competition? Correct answer, this one. And you can tell because marginal revenue and price and demand line are completely horizontal. And they intersect the average total cost line at the lowest point. So all these graphs would be a graph of the industry in the long run. So this would be a perfect competition industry in the long run. This would be a monopolistic competition in the long run. This would be a monopoly in the long run. And this would be an oligopoly in the long run with a price of P0, which would be the most standard price. So there you have it. The next graphs for our next unit are going to focus on a thing called monopsony. So we're going to learn about monopoly and monopsony, and you'll understand why I just did that a little bit later. All right, peace out.